Okay, welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gange. I'm the center's coordinator, and I will also be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker is to my right, it's Sevgi Doğan, and we will very soon switch chairs with the topic In-between Hegel and Marx, Gramsci, storicismo, assoluto, in parentheses, absolute historicism. Now, Sevgi is a postdoctoral fellow at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, Italy. Her main research interests lie in Antonio Gramsci, Hegel, Italian Marxism and idealism, and the reception of those thinkers and positions in Turkey. Of Sevgi's many publications that I recommend you to check out by yourself one by one, I only want to mention two here. She published in 2018 the book Marx and Hegel on the dialectic of the individual and the social with Lexington Books. And in 2021, she published the article Rereading the Notion of Ideology, Luxemburg and Gramsci in the collected volume Rosa Luxemburg, Band 1, Leben und Wirken. Now, this event is the last session of our spring seminar, which has been going on since February already, but it's not our last event before the summer. Exactly in 2 days today, it's 4 o'clock in the same room. We'll have another person here in the room, Julita Slitko-Skaite, our visiting scholar, speaking about Occam and Paris Occamists towards a new approach to the study of late medieval philosophy. And more information about this event and the Zoom link can also be found on our homepage. Now, if you want to stay updated about our activities, our talks, and everything we do, please follow our social media. We have Facebook and X, formerly Twitter. If you, like Yolita, want to become a visiting scholar with us, please check our homepage. All the information is on there. And finally, if you want to speak in our seminar, and that will be the autumn seminar, in a setting very much like this, maybe in this room or online, please also let us know. We are currently beginning or setting up our spring seminar, autumn seminar, but we still have got some empty slots. Now, finally, technicalities. As I said, I will forcibly mute online, or I have already done it, because we have a big speaker here in the middle of the room, just avoiding unnecessary disturbance. And after the talk, there will be a discussion session that I will moderate. We will alternate between the room and online. Especially for the online folk, please first indicate so in the chat that you want to make a comment or criticism or something. I will make a speakers list. Then when it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or you can write your question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. That was it for me. Sevgi, thank you very much. I will just share your presentation, make sure everything works, and then we should go. This. Move this shortly. Absolute muting controls. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for organizing this seminar. And in particular, I want to thank Barış because he suggested me to give a lecture on this topic on historicism. So today's discussion aims to analyze Antonio Gramsci's notion of historicism in the context of a larger early 20th century debate about Marxian historical materialism and its connection to his understanding of politics, both in more general and in revolutionary terms. It has to be emphasized at the beginning that this is not a comprehensive investigation of the totality of his thought. Instead, the goal is to offer a tentative interpretation that aligns closely with the different interpretations Gramsci gives to the notion of historicism and what he calls, following Benedetto Croce, absolute historicism. Having said that, discussing Gramsci's historicism presents three main challenges. Firstly, due to the fact that most of his reflection on historicism were written in a fascist prison, his writing style often consists of fragmented paragraphs which can complicate comprehension. Secondly, his texts are affected by self-censorship due to prison restrictions, thereby further obscuring their meaning. Thirdly, many of Gramsci's key concepts are inherently complex do their previous use in different philosophical and political traditions, and Gramsci's attempt to revise them in the light of the current realities. Moreover, Gramsci doesn't actually provide a clear definition of absolute historicism, using the term only 3 times, while the term historicism appears much more often. Yet, absolute historicism is a fundamentally component of Gramsci's overall work, as suggested by the ongoing discussion about it, both internationally and especially in Italy. Yeah, I can follow from here. This one?
Yes, sure. Yes.
Okay, a little bit context. So what is the philosophical and historical context in which Gramsci developed his absolute historicism? In fact, one may say that there are 2 main origins. Gramsci's through engagement with Marxist historical materialism, which emerges from a confrontation with bourgeois ideology and his historicized critique of this framework. Second, with Benedetto Croce's neo-idealist philosophical concepts and ideas along with his critique of them. Regarding the former, Gramsci specifically opposes the most reductionist, mechanistic, and deterministic form of historical materialism as articulated by the Second International and people like Soviet theorist Nikolai Bukharin in his so-called Manual of Historical Materialism, published shortly after Lenin's death in 1924. By way of example, this is what Gramsci had to say in reference to Bukharin's dogmatic account of a Marxist sociology. Quote, in practice, as I was saying, even historical materialism tends to become an ideology in the negative sense, that is, an absolute and eternal truth. This happens especially when, as in Bukharin's popular manual, historical materialism is confused with vulgar materialism or with the metaphysics of matter, which is bound to be eternal and absolute, unquote. Concerning Croce's historicism, the anti-positivist and partly Marx-inspired Croce argues that life and reality are fundamentally historical, emphasizing the concrete, gradual growth of history in the form of the human spirit over the transhistorical and transcendental progress of reality. In 1917, Croce writes that, quote, if contemporary history springs straight from life, so too does that history which is called non-contemporary, for it is evident that only an inherent in the life of the present can move one to investigate past fact. Therefore, this past fact does not answer to a present interest, a past interest, but to a present interest, insofar as it is unified with an interest of the present life, unquote. In addition, he also emphasized that, quote, history is in all of us, and that its sources are in our own breasts, unquote. According to Crocean expert Marcello Muste, Croce's absolute historicism is based on 2 key elements. First, historicism is the identity of history and philosophy, which is Croce's logic was achieved through the theory of individual judgment. Second, historicism embodies the thesis of contemporaneity of all history, meaning that history as such is always contemporaneous. This thesis implies that, quote, the identity of philosophy and history as the culmination of theoretical knowledge always originate from an interest in present life, from an obscurity that thought is called to illuminate, unquote. Therefore, Croce, following Goethe, described historiography as liberation from history and the past, because, quote, it rises ideal above it and converts it into knowledge, unquote. While appreciating Croce's thought for its instrumental value and while definitely taking the term absolute historicism from him, Gramsci critiques Croce's historicism as speculative and idealist, despite Croce's own claim of having surpassed it. Just three brief examples. In a 1932 letter from prison, Gramsci criticized Croce's idealist understanding of history, writing, quote, Croce claims to have aimed at liberating modern thought from any trace of transcendence theology and therefore traditional metaphysics. However, his philosophy is a speculative philosophy and as such fully continues transcendence and theology in a historicist language. Croce is so immersed in his speculative method and language that he can only judge according to them. Unquote. Elsewhere, Gramsci strongly criticized Croce's anti-revolutionary elitism and fear of the popular mass. Quote, Croce's historiography is a degenerate and mutilated Hegelianism because its fundamental concern is a panicked fear of Jacobin movements, of any active involvement of the Greek popular masses as a factor in historical progress. Finally, Gramsci totally disagreed with what he considered Croce's reduction of Marxism to a mere canon of interpretation of history. Gramsci, on the other hand, drawing on the work of Italy's first Marxist Antonio Labriola, defines Marxism as a philosophy of praxis, constituting an autonomous system of thought, wherein everything is practice, where the distinction will not be between the moments of the absolute spirit, but between structure and superstructure, unquote. Having at least schematically addresses the historical and philosophical context in which Gramsci began to work on his Marxist version of absolute historicism, and before presenting my main arguments, I would now like to briefly present some of the definition and descriptions Gramsci provides of Marxism as a historicism and even an absolute humanism, as well as their reception by contemporary scholarship. To begin with, Gramscian scholar Giuseppe Cospito points out that Gramsci's first definition of Marxism as a historicism can be found in his 1917 polemic with the journalist Filippo Crispolti, in which Gramsci wrote that, quote, "We are historicists, according to philosophical conception that nourishes our movement. We deny the necessity of any a priori, whether transcendent, as religious faith would have it, or even historical like bourgeois privilege." Gramsci's anti-a priorism is also stressed by Esteban Moreira, who affirms that Gramsci's introduced the Crocean term absolute historicism into Marxism to express the rejection of any form of essentialism and a priori theology in the process, giving Marx's philosophy a new sense. Thus, against some of the positive tendency evident in Marx's own work, Gramsci constantly emphasized the significance of human will, self-awareness, initiative, and transformative action, viewing humans as historical subjects. French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, despite a strong critique of Gramsci's absolute historicism and absolute humanism, positively acknowledges precisely this aspect of Gramsci's approach. In Reading Capital, he writes, quote, "By presenting Marxism as historicism, Gramsci is stressing on essential determination of Marxist theory, its practical role in real history. In this respect, the historicism of Marxism is no more than the consciousness of a task and a necessity. Marxism cannot claim to be the theory of history unless, even in its theory, it can think the conditions of this penetration into history, into all state of society, even into man's everyday lives," unquote. Finally, Italian communist leader Palmiro Togliatti elucidates the key role of Gramsci's absolute historicism, both as a philosophical doctrine and as a Marxist analytical approach. As indicated above, Gramsci termed his approach as anti-Croce, that is, critical engagement with the philosophy of spirit, which at the time was considered the prototypical expression of Italian bourgeois culture. This approach aimed to transcend the speculative and abstract nature inherent in this philosophy. Consequently, Gramsci names his Marxism not only a philosophy of praxis, but also, similar to Croce, an absolute historicism, but this time liberated from theological speculative remanence and idealism, thereby reinstating an authentic dialectical engagement with reality. Gramsci writes, quote, "The philosophy of praxis is the historicized conception of reality, freedom from any trace of transcendence and theology, even in their latest speculative incarnation. Croce's idealistic historicism still remains in the theological speculative phase." Unquote. This historicized conception of reality was called by Italian philosopher Nicola Badoloni a new historicism without myths. For him, it possessed the capacity to identify the relatively permanent aspect of the economic realm, and most importantly, to engage with them through conscious human praxis, aiming to both challenge and reshape them. In other words, as Badoloni emphasized, quote, "With the concept of absolute historicism, Gramsci is pointing to the necessity for Marxism to become history, to concretely realize this socialization of the economy and of politics, which as a theory, it enables us to emerge as a real historical possibility." Unquote. In short, and this time using Gramsci's own words, his absolute historicism encompasses three key aspects. First, the total liberation from all ideologism, meaning the real conquest of the historical world. Second, the absolute worldliness and earthliness of thought. And third, the organization and theoretical arrangement of the complex of issue facing a revolutionary force, which represent the historical unity or totality of theory and praxis. With this introductory overview of Gramsci's notion of absolute historicism in mind, let's pursue my main arguments. For the purpose of today's presentation, I would like to emphasize 6 main points. 1, that Gramsci is indeed a Marxist. 2, how closely Gramsci's concept of absolute historicism aligns with Marx's historical materialism. 3, Gramsci's absolute historicism is an absolute humanism. 4, Gramsci's absolute historicism is more Hegelian than Crocean, as it retains the influence of Hegelian dialectics. 5, the nature of Gramsci's absolute historicism can be understood through his analysis of culture and ideology. Lastly, as opposed to Crocean historicized reformism, Gramsci's absolute historicism aims at revolutionizing society and of creating a new human being and a new social order as an alternative to capitalism. Let's go point by point. So, Gramsci is a Marxist. In recent decades, a number of scholars have tried to make an argument about Gramsci's non-Marxism, basically presenting him as a democratic reformer. Gramscian scholar Peter Thomas highlights how some commentators argue that Gramsci initially embraced Marxism but eventually diverged into a non-Marxist, non-Marxian direction. However, this notion is mistaken. While Gramsci's ideas can certainly not be labeled as orthodox textbook Marxism, he never broke away from Marxism in any significant way. Rather, we may say that Gramsci historicized Marxism by attributing new meanings to it as a result of his concrete engagement with the concrete reality he lived in. His innovation, in fact, do not distance him from Marx's theory, but instead enrich it. So this first argument will become more evident as I discuss the subsequent points. So let's move on the second, next point. So in Marxist theory, historian Eric Hobsbawm emphasized the widely accepted notion that thinkers do not originate their ideas in isolation, but rather within the historical and political context of their time. In this regard, one can assert that Marx highlights two principles. First, individuals can shape their own history. Second, however, they can only do so within the constraints of their circumstances. In addition to these principles, Marx's approach to materialism and history is grounded in his critiques of idealism and existing materialist views, which he regards as speculative, metaphysical, and transcendent rather than immanent. In the first thesis on Feuerbach, where Marx critiques existing materialist views, he asserts that, quote, the thing, reality, sensuousness is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as human sensuous activity, practice, not subjectivity, unquote. By examining Marx's emphasis on individuals shaping their own history within given circumstances, we can better understand the depth of his historical materialism, as highlighted by David Harvey's analysis of Marx's writings. Beginning with the question, what was Marx's historical materialism really all about? Harvey directs our focus to a long footnote in volume 1 of Capital, where Marx intervenes discussions of history and materialism. By way of examples, Marx affirms that, quote, first, a critical history of technology will show how little any of the inventions of 18th century are the work of a single individual. Second, how technology discloses man's mode of dealing with nature, the process of production by which he sustains his life, and thereby also lies bare the mode of formation of his social relation and of the mental conception that flew from them. And third, how the weak points in the abstract materialism of natural science, a materialism that excludes history and its process, are not once evident from the abstract and ideological conception of its representatives whenever they go beyond the limits of their own speciality. Unquote. In essence, Marx underscores the significance of a materialist and historical examination in comprehending a collective social dynamics while criticizing abstract materialism for its oversight of historical development. Harvey highlights that the theory of historical materialism posits that capital has evolved historically through interactions among 6 elements: technology, nature, life's production, labor, mental conception of the world, social relation, class or gender, and the state's administration and the law and state. Historical materialism thus aims to comprehensively grasp society by examining all these elements within the totality, dialectically and relationally. It examines their interrelations, dynamics of change, and how such transformation resonate across other elements and in the process affect historical change. This content is precisely what Gramsci attempts to achieve in his prison notebooks. I would argue that the approximate equivalent of Marx's notion of totality is what Gramsci calls the historical block, defined as the unity between nature and spirit, or structure and superstructure, embodying the unity of opposite and distincts. Intrinsically and apparently inspired by Marx's 6 thesis on Feuerbach, which states that, quote, man is the ensemble of the social relations. Gramsci also affirms that the human being is to be, quote, conceived as an historical block of purely individual and subjective elements and of mass and objective elements with which the individual is in an active relationship. Thus, to transform the external world, the general system of relations is to potentiate and to develop oneself, unquote. I think that the notion of historical block expresses the idea of totality by illustrating how the unity of structure, economic base, and superstructure, culture, ideology, politics, forms a coherent and dynamic whole in constant evolution. A historical block is a historically specific formation where these interconnected elements mutually reinforce the principle of absolute historicism, which understand history as a complex, dynamic, subaltern-led process of fundamental social change shaped by the interaction of various social, economic, and cultural factors. Having said that, Gramsci argues that specific historical contexts create the foundation of specific cultural, political, and intellectual responses and developments. For instance, according to Luciano Gruppi, when Gramsci discusses the so-called Southern question, dealing with the difficulties faced by people in the Italian South, he not only identifies a specific structure, but also delineates the historically and politically concrete manner in which the Southern question manifests itself, encompassing the relationship between economic structure and social alignments, political forces, intellectual dynamics, and cultural hegemony, which refers to the domination of society by the ideologies and values of ruling class. In doing so, Gramsci effectively correlates the notion of hegemony to the concept of historical block, that thus working out how a given hegemony manifests within the specific context provided by a given historical block. The various moments that constitute the historical block are understood within the distinction between structure and superstructure, yet they are also captured in their dialectical relation. Based on the above, it becomes clear why Gramsci directs his criticism at a form of historicism that focuses solely on the ethical political dimension of history while downplaying real existing economic and class forces that influence and drive historical developments. This approach of reducing history to the history of the supposedly growing spirit ultimately rationalizes and uncritically justifies every historical moment as the class and the political characteristics of these moments are obscured. To bring my second arguments to a conclusion, according to Andre Friedberg, it is not only the Marx of Capital, but also Marx's early writings that have contributed to the development of Gramsci's absolute historicism. Within this early text, Marx's conception of historical materialism can be interpreted as what we might call a humanist historicism, which I contend will become one of the bases of what Gramsci later calls an absolute humanism. In the manuscripts, Marx views history as a process of people's active negation of the alienation imposed by capitalist society. In contrast to Hegel's conception of history, which attributes historical development to the emanation of the spirit, Marx places collective human activity or praxis as the central subject of a changing history. Speaking of Marxian and Gramscian humanism, this brings us to my third argument, which is to look at the Gramsci's absolute historicism as what he calls absolute humanism. In Gramsci's historicism, a realist interpretation, Esteban Moreira engages deeply with Gramsci's historical approach. He presents four interconnected meanings. First, historicism as transience Second, historicism as historical necessity. Third, historicism as realism. And last one, historicism as humanism. In fact, a good deal of attention has been paid to the last point. For Gramsci, quote, historicism is a philosophy that does not recognize transcendent or immanent elements in the metaphysical sense, but is completely grounded on the concrete action of man, who works and transforms reality for his historical needs, unquote. According to Morera, it is in this sense that we must interpret Gramsci when he asserts that the philosophy of praxis is an absolute historicism or an absolute humanism. In other words, the emphasis lies on Gramsci's deeply humanistic view of history. Basing himself on the quotes from Gramsci, Fabio Frosini highlights two key features that illustrate historicism as humanism. First, historicism as a total liberation from any ideologism, the real conquest of the historical world. Second, its immanentist quality, meaning absolute historicism as the absolute humanist embodiment of the absolute worldly and earthly nature of thought. Furthermore, Nicola Badoloni elucidates Gramsci's perspective by explaining the latter's definition of man as a series of active relationships, suggesting that humans do not merely relate to nature by their natural existence, but actively engage with it through labor and technology as mentioned above. Therefore, Gramsci posits that each individual embodies not only the synthesis of existing relationships, but also the history of these relationships, thereby representing the historicity culmination of the entire past. At this point, Badoloni asks, how is it possible to change the world if individuals are so profoundly shaped by their past and existing relationships? Gramsci's answer is as follows, quote, it will be said that what each individual can change is very little relative to their own strength. This is true only up to a certain point, because the individual can associate with all those who desire the same change. And if this change is rational, the individual can multiply themselves by an impressive number of times and achieve a much more radical change than what may initially seem possible, unquote. Elsewhere, Gramsci feels the need to fully explore his concept of integral humanism and absolute historicism by advancing a dialectical process that introduces a new dimension involving structure and superstructure. The conquest of economic reality is only superficially our sole aim. Through it, we pave the way for the complete free individual, and we fervently desire that the new moral life to be expanded to the greatest number of individuals. A great deal of work must be done by us, socialists, unquote. According to Ercan Yegarin, Gramsci combines historical materialism with humanism, historicism, freedom, and idealism to emphasize his rejection of positivism as a philosophical framework. This can be seen in the following passage by Gramsci, quote, it has been forgotten that in the case of historical materialism, one should put the accent on the first term, historical, and not on the second, which is of metaphysical origin. The philosophy of praxis is absolute historicism, the absolute secularization and earthliness of thought, and absolute humanism of history. It is along this line that one must trace the thread of the new conception of the world, unquote. To recap, Gramsci's view of history adapts a humanist perspective rooted in the tangible action of individuals who, driven by historical imperatives, engage in the active transformation of reality. Here, the emphasis is on the activity and praxis. Importantly, however, Gramsci asserts that history cannot be reconstructed, quote, through mathematical calculation, and no initiative force is realized immediately. Rather, It is always a blend of rationality and irrationality, free will and necessity. It is life, with all the strains and weakness of life, with its contradiction and antithesis." Unquote. Besides, Gramsci seeks to infuse historicism with a fresh understanding through what might be called an immanent humanism. In a passage in 1933, Gramsci writes, "Hegelian immanentism becomes historicism, but it is absolute historicism only with the philosophy of praxis, absolute historicism or absolute humanism." In sum, Gramsci's humanism can be summarized as such. First, human liberation from alienation and the free development of individual. Second, the importance of human agency and collective and organized will in historical development. And third, the emphasis on immanentism over transcendence. Building on this humanist interpretation, I now turn to my fourth argument, which focuses on the role of Hegelian dialectics as well as Hegel's notion of immanence and the absolute. In general terms, Gramsci openly acknowledged his debt to Hegel, affirming that the philosophy of praxis is the translation of Hegelianism into historicist language. Unquote. One element of this act of translation via Marx and Croce is Gramsci's adaptation of a dialectical approach to history, with the dialectic being not only a mere technique, but also a new thought, a new philosophy. In Gramsci's case, this new philosophy means understanding historical processes as characterized by contradictions, conflicts, and evolving relationships between different social forces and classes. This dialectical perspective underscores the idea that history is not static, but marked by continual change and transformation. Gramsci attributes crucial importance to Hegel's dialectic because it has the capacity to reconcile opposites, thereby challenging and even overcoming the traditional dichotomy between idealism and materialism. The scholar Roberto Finelli highlights these Hegelian attempts to transcend the dichotomies such as matter versus spirit, finite versus infinite, good versus evil, and being versus becoming, signifying a notable progression for modern culture. At the same time, this pursuit led a rigorous focus on an immanence, eliminating dualism between the concrete sensory world and the realm of transcendent ideas and spirit. In this sense, immanentism aligns closely with a rigorous historicism, seeking to interpret human behavior and interaction solely through their actions and relationships without invocating transcendent supernatural factors. Returning to dialectics, Gramsci found in Hegel the dialectical source of the Marxist unity between theory and praxis. Gramsci writes, "But the passage from Hegel, German tranquil theory and French practical effects, seems to me much more important as the source of the view expressed by Marx in the thesis on Feuerbach, that the philosophers have explained the world and the point now is to change it. In other words, that philosophy must become politics or practice in order for it to continue to be philosophy. The source then of the theory of the unity of theory and practice." Applying this to the after-mentioned discussion on the historical blocks as a key element of Gramsci's absolute historicism, Gramsci sees in his structure quote, a non-mechanical dialectical causation of the superstructure, unquote, while dialectically affirming that, quote, the superstructure reacts dialectically to the structure and modifies it, unquote. Moving on to admittedly very tentative engagement with the Hegelian absolute, while some Marxists reject Hegel's absolute for being overly dogmatic and closed ontology, Gramsci utilized it as a critical element in his own framework. Though we don't know whether Gramsci reads Hegel's Science of Logic, in my view, Gramsci's use of the absolute might be inspired by a passage where Hegel described the absolute idea as, quote, the identity of the theoretical and practical idea, unquote, which, quote, contains within itself the highest degree of opposition, unquote. In this Hegelian absolute, all distinctions are not merely negated but sublated. In sum, Gramsci's absolute historicism is arguably more Hegelian than Crocean, as it retains the historicized influence of various Hegelian notions such as dialectics, immanentism, and absolute. Building on the Hegelian influences in Gramsci's absolute historicism, we now turn to my fifth argument, which examines the relationship between absolute historicism and the realms of culture and ideology. In Gramsci's conception of history, culture and ideology play a crucial role in shaping historical process, both from above and below. For instance, he introduces the concepts of and the struggle for cultural hegemony, which refers to the dominance of a particular set of ideas, values, and beliefs within society. Expanding on Marx, but taking the actual term from Lenin, Gramsci argues that ruling classes maintain power not only through economic means, but also through the dissemination of their cultural and ideological perspectives, whether by force or persuasion. Gramsci makes it clear, however, that this hegemony from above is never entirely stable and is constantly confronted by counter-hegemonic projects from below, whose goal is to revolutionize the status quo. In his 1916 article, Socialism and Culture, he writes, quote, every revolution has been preceded by an intense labor of criticism, by the diffusion of culture and the spread of ideas amongst masses of men who are at first resistant and think only of solving their own immediate economic and political problems for themselves, who have no ties of solidarity with others in the same condition, unquote. According to Bukharin, it is important to read all of Gramsci's writings up to 1920 because in them, Gramsci addresses the issue of education, popular culture, and the school system, offering a relentless criticism of positivist ideas and other key cultural notions popular at the time. Yet, Gramsci's engagement is not only critical. On the contrary, Bukharin argues that Gramsci, time and again, asserts that culture is constantly and fundamentally an active process of human liberation, whether it involves the natural sciences, the evolution of technology, or moral disciplines. For him, culture represents the attainment of historical and critical methods and signifies a conquest of the human spirit embodying a humanistic essence. Touching briefly on the complex question of ideology, Gramsci develops his own investigation of the role of ideology with Marx and against Croce. In a piece called Croce and Marx, he focuses Croce of misinterpreting Marxian superstructure and ideology for dismissing the notion of superstructure as a mere appearance or illusion. Gramsci corrects Croce by stating, for Marx, ideologies are an objective and operative reality. It is not the ideologies that create social reality, but social reality in its productive structure that creates ideologies. Even Marx theories are a superstructure. Marx explicitly states that humans become conscious of their task on the ideological terrain of the superstructure. And the aim of his history is to make a specific social group become conscious of its own task, its own power, its own coming into being. But he destroys the ideologies of the antagonistic social groups. Those ideologies are in fact practical instruments of political domination over the rest of society. And Marx shows how they are meaningless because they are in contradiction with actual reality. Unquote. In the same passage, while discussing the historical block, Gramsci emphasized the vital organic relationship between the first element, which is material condition and structure, and the second elements, culture and ideology, as superstructures. In short, Gramsci rejects any deterministic and mechanistic view of the relationship between structure, the social relation of production, and superstructures, ideas, customs, moral behaviors, human will. Instead of a simple cause and effect connection, there are mutual relationships and reaction that must be studied within the concrete historical development. This relationship involves distinction and dialectics, ultimately resulting in a real unity that allows for historical change. Following Gramsci's perspective on the dynamic interplay between structure and superstructure, ideology and culture, we now turn to my sixth and final argument, which addresses revolutionary praxis in relation to Gramsci's absolute historicism. This will be last.
No. You'll find in terms of time.
Basing himself on Gramsci's own affirmation of historicism being tantamount to the political emergence of a new civilization, unquote, that is socialism, Badoloni asserts that the first sense of historicism for Gramsci is taking the concrete form of problem of revolution. As opposite to Croce's reformist absolute historicism, advocating a ground of history without ever overcoming exploitation and injustice, Gramsci therefore advocates for a revolutionary absolute historicism informed by a revolutionary praxis, which during the historical period of capitalist class society involves people actively engaging in political and cultural struggle to challenge hegemony, capitalist ideologies and values with the aim to fundamentally reshape existing power relations in the direction of a communist society. Gramsci, as Marx before him, insists on this historical capacity of subaltern social classes and groups. As previously suggested, Gramsci holds that subaltern groups who are historically most passive can become active when, with the support of their own organic intellectual, they consider themselves as a subject of their action and their own history and life, which is when they can begin to transform unjust society into a just society while dialectically transforming themselves in the process. Gramsci is fully conscious that the proletarian revolution is a very long historical process, but a close reading of his text leaves no room for doubt that he believes that this process can succeed. Moving towards the conclusion, Gramsci's historicism offers a complex and dialectical understanding of history, emphasizing the interplay between material condition, cultural dynamics, and human agency in shaping historical processes. His approach highlights the transformative potential of subaltern historical consciousness and collective action in their quest to establish the classless society, and as we just saw, Gramsci is absolutely convinced that this can and will be achieved. From a Gramscian absolute historicist perspective, one is now attempting to ask, what will happen to the philosophy of praxis after the subaltern revolution and transition to the much desired classless society now under contradiction and construction? Gramsci's response is absolute. Quote, that philosophy of praxis thinks of itself in a historicized manner, that is, as a transitory phase of philosophical thought, as is made quite explicit in the well-known thesis that historical development will at a certain point be characterized by the passage from the realm of necessity to realm of freedom. The philosophy of praxis is an expression of historical contradictions. If it is demonstrated that contradiction will disappear, it is also demonstrated implicitly that the philosophy of praxis too will disappear or to be superseded. In the reign of freedom, thought and ideas can no longer be born on the terrain of contradiction and the necessity of struggle, unquote. In other words, and we must be really emphatic here, what Gramsci is proposing is an absolute historicization of the philosophy of praxis, that is Marxism itself, by acknowledging its historical characters as a transitory phase of philosophical thought, whose historical role, aided by its organic intellectuals, it is to help the subaltern classes to make the revolution, since after the revolution, with the advent of their classless society being born within a new reign of freedom, Marxism will either disappear or be superseded. Unsettling as this may sound to those for whom Marxism has, admit or not, an almost transcendental value, Gramsci understands that historical Marxism, being a philosophy that emerged out of the particular contradiction of capitalist society and with its historical role as midwife of the new classless society successfully accomplished, will no longer have a role to play in the new, truly free society. However, the classless society being a society free of contradiction does not imply a society in which there are no more problems to be analyzed and overcome. Gramsci's mentioning of the fact that the philosophy of praxis will be superseded allows us to affirm that the new society with its new human beings and its new challenges will definitely require a new philosophy and, of course, a new philosophers of a new praxis. Is it too much to want to believe that two of these new philosophers would be a new Marx and a new Gramsci, once again interpreting the word in order to this time around collectively enjoy it? Thank you very much for this. And at the end, I put some bibliography about Gramsci, historicism, contemporary Marxist thought. In one side, there is in English and the other side in Italian, but this is just limited some of the sources that we can. I put.
Well, thank you very much. I suggest we
switch
spots. I'll check the online button. And first, maybe some questions from the question from in the room. Right. From in the room, let's start. Anybody have a question in here first?
Oh, you may check online.
Oh, yeah, no, but maybe I have to unmute them. I think it's easier from the room first. You want to start, Joni Matti?
Well, I don't have anything very enlightening to say. It was very interesting talk. I don't know much Gramsci at all, so I don't have very nuanced comments. But maybe start with the small clarification and then the question. What I didn't understand in the beginning is it was somewhere in the slides. I can't even locate where, but you will talk about getting rid of transcendental somehow. But then they were being continuous with transcendental and theological somewhere up there. So I'm not sure what was the meaning. I don't know if you can get what I say. In a way, getting rid of it, but then being continuous with the transcendental, or clarify if that was a misunderstanding on my part. What I found interesting in general about this approach, but it's surely well known. I think the Marxism seems to be pretty close to pragmatism, American pragmatism, and especially the part of it where it's really reduced. Is it the transcendence reduced to the acts of men or to the praxis? So that's just an open question. Are you interested in pragmatism as well, or how you see the connection to practice schooling? well, come from the USA.
Yeah. Actually, I'm not too much informed about the pragmatism. I know a little bit about it. So I don't know how. Also, I know the pragmatism also puts the center of their discussion, their life and their practical, their experience with the life. But maybe I can say that in the philosophical, the relationship between life and the experiences, that we can find kind of the common elements in pragmatism and in Marxism. In the sense that, in Hegelian sense, that the experiences from individual to practical life. But I think in political level, maybe they differentiated from each other with pragmatism. In philosophical level, in some way, maybe the experiences part, the consciousness part, to have the consciousness to look the experiences in Hegelian sense, that we can find also pragmatism. In this sense, maybe they can close to each other.
Yeah.
Because I find also very close to, particularly the early writing of Marx, close to Hegelian understanding of the consciousness, and particularly in 1844 manuscripts, for example, related too much to Hegelian understanding the consciousness and experiences, and how the individual or the class itself, in his practical activity, his own activity, become aware of their class consciousness and their individual consciousness, of course, with Hegel separated in the sense of class. But in this sense, maybe because, as I know from American pragmatism, they are very much influenced of the Hegelian, particularly consciousness in Hegel. And in this sense, they can come close, but in political level, I think they are differentiated. In political level. So in Marxism, more this action is not only action for the individual base, but it is a collective action. So in this sense, the maybe pragmatism more individualistic level can be explained in more individualistic and more the individual, how individual can the consciousness of himself through these historical processes, through his historical processes in Hegelian sense. But in Marxism, it is more collective. It's the collective that play more important role in Marxism. But in pragmatism, it is more individual-based understanding. That, let's say, individual consciousness in the individual base more functions.
Well, there is much talk about communities as well in practice, but not class as such.
Maybe community again coming from Hegel.
Could be. Did you understand the transcendence? I mean, we can go up the slides. Do we have the slides?
I'm shared them already.
It was being getting rid of it and nevertheless we continue.
Where was it?
Criticism of Croce.
Was in the beginning somewhere.
Somewhere around the beginning.
The first or second.
Oh, there was. Yeah. Was it there? What was the next one?
Yes.
No, it's not. Actually, well, no, never mind. We can come back to it.
Okay, maybe we go next to. Is there online any immediate question? James has unmuted, yes?
Yes, if I may.
Please, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting and a lot to absorb. There's many directions I could go in. I was just interested in a couple. I mean, one is, it's always struck me that there's a sort of convergence between different senses of historicism. I'm thinking here of the Popperian sense of the term historicism, which seems to be the opposite of Croce's sense of historicism. But oddly enough, one of the charges brought against adherence to both understandings of historicism is that it takes away the will to act. And this is what Benjamin used to say, essentially, about historical determinism, which he saw in the German Social Democrats in the 1930s. The idea that if you think history is going one way, you don't need to do anything, it's going to happen anyway. Now, Croce was charged with exactly the same sort of what you might call, I can't think of the word now, sort of quietism, in the sense that, you know, he was charged by Guido de Ruggiero and others, and I notice a Rick Peters here, so he will correct me when I'm wrong. But he was charged by de Ruggiero of essentially saying, well, you just have to acquiesce in what is. Now, it strikes me that Gramsci is fighting a battle on both fronts against Croce in this sense, because Gramsci wants to insist, as your slides show very carefully, that we can make history, but not in conditions of our own choosing. So he's an anti-Gramsci, an anti-Croce. He's also an anti-certain understandings of a determinist theory of history, including, but not only including, the Marxist view of history. Now, I suppose there are several questions there. I mean, the first question is just, what do you think of what I'm saying? Is that a fair summary of some of the issues? But secondly, and this is a more historical question, I don't know what people at the time in Italy knew about Gramsci outside his own immediate circle. So de Ruggiero, you see, I don't know, I don't recall seeing mentions of Gramsci in de Ruggiero's works. I may be wrong, but I don't recall having seen them there. Certainly in other parts of Europe, Gramsci only became known much, much later in any important sense. So, a British idealist like Collingwood never refers to Gramsci at all. And I don't know whether he'd ever heard of it. I certainly hadn't discussed it with people like de Ruggiero, with whom he had an ongoing dialogue. So that's just a question about what other people at the time knew about Gramsci's interpretation of Croce. Thank you.
Okay. I will begin with second question, because the first question I couldn't get it. The first question. So I will begin the second question. Second question is the period after the Gramsci in 1940s. You mean if Gramsci's? Actually, Gramsci's Gramsci works begin to published after 1950s. But some selected passages from Gramsci prison notebooks, not all notebooks in this period published. So in 1970s, 71 or 75, the all Gramsci notebooks published, but in the 1950s, by particularly the Communist Party leaders, Olyatti, selected some Gramsci's passages from prison notebooks they published, and so not all Gramsci's passages that includes historicism that discussed in this period. But the first discussion in 1916s begin to discuss by the Italian scholars, not outside Italy, but inside Italy, 1960s, 70s, they begin to think about the particularly Nicola Badolini, per esempio, 1965, if I'm not wrong, write an article on Gramsci's historicism. So in this period, they begin to discuss, but not outside Italy. In Italian language, they discuss broadly about, they begin to discuss about generally Gramsci's concepts like historicism, like philosophy of praxis, historical block, and then when the all Quaderni prison notebooks published in 1970s, also translated in English, then they began to discuss it. But the discussion widely on historicism exists in Italian intellectual world, particularly compared with the Croce's understanding of historicism. The first question, if
I could have another go at the first question. I mean, it was a little bit more than a question,
Shortly.
but if I could just say something. I mean, I suppose the point I was making is that when, for example, Walter Benjamin was writing, he was writing because he saw that a false conception of history had gripped a major political party and stopped them from acting properly. That was his concern. De Ruggiero said exactly the same about Croce. He's saying, in effect, Croce's view about history means that he's defending the idea of doing nothing and just waiting to see how it'll come out. It'll be all right in the end. That's roughly what the criticism that De Ruggiero was making of Croce. And the point is, it was a very heated political moment, because in the one case, people were not fighting Nazism properly, and in the other case, they weren't fighting fascism properly. That was the point that I was trying to get at, and I just wondered what you thought about that way of looking at it. By the time you get to the 1970s, for example, which is the time I first started hearing of Gramsci, that particular debate was well over. You know, wasn't being talked about. In the 1930s, it was a very current question of your view of history affects your understanding of politics, and it does it for the worst. Therefore, you need to change your view of history.
Yes, it is your point already in Prism notebooks by Gramsci directed to Croce, the Croce's understanding of history, because Croce's understanding of history based on the individual actions and not collectivity doesn't exist, and Croce is more puts the center the liberation, the liberty, not liberation, but liberty, but eliminate or didn't want to see the necessity. So in this sense, and also Gramsci particularly criticized Croce for he identified history and philosophy, but according to Gramsci, if you identified history and philosophy, then from you can arrive that philosophy and history and politics also identical. So it means that the action and the theory cannot be separated from the history. So in this sense, the Gramsci criticized Croce. You couldn't just say the history is contemporary history and the individual is defined, determined the history, and you should live it, and you should not he doesn't say not act, because the action is also there, but the individual and each individual's action creates a spirit, and then the history can be changed. But this individual, it seems to me in Croce's historicism, not like in against Gramsci's and Marx's historicism, there isn't any relationship between, since there isn't relationship between these individual, and the relationship is missing in the Croce's understanding history. If relationship is missing, then each individual can contribute with their action to process of the history of the progression of history, and he doesn't use progress. He's against the progress, and he used the gradual growth. So growth means that there isn't kind of the ending, but there is a growth. There is different from the progress. The progress brings you some kind of elimination or some kind of ending. But the growth actually ground is doesn't what Gramsci and Marx aim to arrive the not an end but an end of a exploitative society, status quo society, and to begin a new one. In this sense, Gramsci also criticized in prison notebooks Croce for this understanding of the history. I don't know if I'm able to answer your question.
Thank you very much. Rick is here now, so I'll let him speak, but thank you very much for that.
Someone to speak. So we have on the list Kari, Rick, Barish, and I myself would also like to say something at one point. And Yolita, Rick, is it directly on this? Otherwise, Kari goes next. Unless it's directly on.
Okay.
Okay, well then.
Thank you.
No, then Kari goes first, then Rick.
Okay, just some comments. There are many very interesting things. But on Gramsci reception, I just tell you that first Finnish translations of notebooks were at the end of 70s. So it's maybe in 1970s when Gramsci became more known in the Western world. I think two concepts are central. Of course, Gramsci uses this philosophy of praxis as a synonym of Marxism in general. But do you think that concept of praxis as a theoretical concept is central for Gramsci's historism? For young Marx, of course, praxis was very central, and it means that in individual historical action is actually that we must try to explain, and from there is no historical determinism, no economic determinism. Actually, according to Gramsci. So is this concept of praxis connected to the concept of historicism, and how?
Yeah. Yes, Gramsci called Marxism in prison notebooks as philosophy of praxis, but in different passages, he not only called Marxism as philosophy of praxis, but also philosophy of praxis diverged from Marxism itself, in the sense that he gives the new meaning to the praxis of philosophy. So because of the prison censorship, he couldn't use too much the Marxism or other terms can refer to Marxism. He, for example, used the founder of philosophy of praxis for Marx and Lenin called. So he couldn't use some name, and he gives the name philosophy of praxis. But it doesn't mean that philosophy of praxis is just a name for Marxism. It is more than that. So I believe that the praxis in like in Marx also at the center of the historical in the understanding of Gramsci's history, in the sense that history is through the combination of the theory and praxis will be determined by the transformative subject, which is for them is class or for Gramsci subaltern classes, not only proletarian classes but subaltern classes. That includes also peasants, also other that we could not put in the under the working class and peasants. So in this sense, praxis is philosophy of praxis as a combination of the structure and superstructure can give the way to change the history, in the sense that, different from understanding of previous Marxist understanding like Lenin, the history will be changed, but not and immediately, in the sense that with yes, the revolution will change it, but before revolution, the subaltern class should able to have consciousness when they arrive the moment of the change. So in this sense, praxis is there always, not before the revolution. You need to consciousness to aware, to ideologically to aware of where you are arriving and what are you doing in these processes. And in this sense, I mentioned the culture and ideology as a deterministic elements for the historical change. So Gramsci, in the sense, he historicized Marxist terminology, and he gave the new meaning, like the philosophy of praxis. So and using also the Hegelian understanding, the for example, the absolute, the unity of the theory, which includes in the philosophy of praxis. So it is not the moment before the taking the power, the history will be already begin to determined by the working class or the subaltern class taking their through their action and through their organic intellectuals kind of to direct them or to give the way, and in this way they can begin to change the history. In this sense, there is a connection between the practice and history. But this history, before coming to power, already begin to change in their history, and also in the universal relation with others' individual history.
Okay,
Okay.
is it right on this?
Do you mean the past? Is the history like, what do we know about how the class or this particular group was living? To change the history, what does it really mean? Because it's really quite confusing. To change what we know about what happened in the past, to change the narrative, or to change, you mean to not repeat the same mistakes that
The change the present time, but
Okay.
the present time, maybe in this sense, Gramsci a little bit Crocean, because the present time also the past. So to change the present time, the status quo, which we find ourselves inside the existing condition, circumstances.
Okay, so
Because the past is already past, but not repeat what happened in the past, that we have to change the new, because the past we couldn't.
yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So on the list we have next Rick, then Ravish, then myself, and maybe that was your lead already, or should
I have
different question, okay, then yours on it, but good. Next is Rick from online, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. If you allow me to connect to the previous discussion, some points, I think James is right. In Collingwood, there's no mention of Gramsci, and as far as I can remember, De Ruggiero doesn't discuss it, but I will look it up. De Ruggiero lived till 48, so he might have known some of Gramsci's work. But then connecting to the discussion. So yes, you are right. Gramsci sometimes distinguishes his own version of Marxism by calling it la filosofia della praxis, the philosophy of praxis. Yeah, sometimes I switch to Italian, but I will correct. And I think it's important in his development that he, if I remember correctly, he somewhere says that he was so fond of Croce that he almost identified with his philosophy, especially the aesthetics. So here is one line you can follow. Young Gramsci reading all of the aesthetics. But then there is Croce, of course, the Croce philosopher of history with the identity of philosophy of history, which, as James already pointed out, leads to the word they often use is Olympianism. So Croce sitting high on the Olympus, or better, the Vesuvius, and watching what is happening in the world, but not able to interfere. So Gramsci, being a Marxist, he cannot work with that identity of philosophy of history. And now my point, because there's another Italian who is also working on the identity of philosophy and history, in which philosophy and reflection on philosophy becomes the historic. Excuse me, I take that back. So historical reflection on philosophy promulgates new philosophy, and that's of course Giovanni Gentile, author of La Filosofia della Prassi, which was lauded, by the way, praised by Lenin in 1905 as the best account of Marxism ever. So that's an interesting sideway. But look, my question is then, what's your thought about Gentile's role in Gramsci's Filosofia della Prassi? Because there you find a philosophy which completely identifies thought and action. And to the extent that even the distinction between historical narrative and the past completely vanishes. They said it in other terms, but to write history becomes a deed. To change reality now, in the here and now, means that you have to produce new historical narratives. They said it in Latin, Historia rerum gestarum identifies with res geste. So it's a complete identification of thought and action. And of course, that is grist to the mill of an activist like Gramsci. He can do business with that philosophy. So what's your thought on that relationship, Gramsci, Gentile?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Yes, in prison notebooks, many times Gramsci also refers to Gentile.
Right.
But usually he, as I understand from his passages, he compared more Croce and Gentile, and he always finds Gentile more limited, but and Croce is for Gramsci is more let's say the philosopher who widely discussed the philosophical and political and cultural in this sense, for Gramsci, Croce is more widely intellectually more how to say, more representative of the Italian bourgeois ideology, let's say. Even though Gentile is more stronger in political sense, but Croce has more influence over the society. So thinking about your question, I think it is right that we can see strong influence of Croce and Gentile over Gramsci's thought. I really didn't think about this relationship between Gentile mostly, particularly about action and thought, because also Gentile, in his critiques of philosophy of Marxism, when he criticized Marxist philosophy, he never, I think when we look to, maybe we should also think about this. Now while I'm thinking, I'm also remembering the things about Gentile and Gramsci. When I read to Gentile's critics the philosophy of Marxism, he wrote about philosophy of Marxism, very short books. And there, when he criticized Marxism, I think he working on the Marxism and working also Croce working on Marxism, they took many elements from Marxism. I think that they are beginning with Hegelian idealism, but they are taking this praxis from Marxist understanding, because they studied Marxism, they studied it for criticizing and for attacking Marxism because of the historical also conditioned conjectures that one we think. And I think maybe I can say that I was thinking also about it, the Gentiles, how much Marxism, when I work a little bit the relationship between Gentile and Italian neo-idealism, Italian like Croce and Gentile, how Marxism and Marx work influenced Croce's and Gentile's work, Gentile's thought. And I come to conclusion that these praxis, the action, the agency, the activity itself is coming to their philosophy from Marx. It is my interpretation. They're coming from of course, their reading of Antonio Labriola also affect, I think, particularly Croce. So I think now, while thinking about your question, and in the past, I was thinking about how the Marx works influence their works. I think they are taking many elements to kind of to idealize these elements or Marxist elements, and to use them and to create their philosophy. To attualismo, for example, attualismo di Gentile, I think it is coming from Marx concepts of praxis. So I think maybe when we see that Gentile's concept of praxis or action or thought, the relationship between action and thought, and the identity between action and thought, maybe coming from indirectly, actually from Marx. This is now I'm thinking about it. Yes, there is some kind of relationship between the Gentilian understanding, also we can find in Marx, but we should keep in mind that Gentile also read a lot Marx and know Marx and criticize too much Marx, and taking these elements, this praxis itself from Marx, I think.
Okay.
This is
We have
my
a few-
interpretation.
We have a few more questions, so okay, we'll move on. We can come back to this later if there's time. Banish.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was impressive for me. I have two short questions, but first I make a footnote on the first discussion, the relation between the philosophy of praxis and pragmatism or Marxism. And please correct me if I'm wrong, this term of philosophy of praxis coined by Antonio Labriola for the first time.
Yeah.
I think pragmatists in the United States, they were mostly involved in liberal circles, even neoliberal circles. So on the political level, they are totally divergent. But on the philosophical level, yeah, we can find some elements. So my first question, right in between beginning and the end of your presentation, there was a definition of culture. I think it was uttered by Gramsci. You said that culture is active process of human liberation. This is just about my sensitivity of terms. So I was wondering about the original Italian term because I'm not sure whether or not it is the right term because there's one term called emancipation and liberation. So maybe in the Marxist context, emancipation could be the right one. Maybe you can specify the difference between them. And my second question is just a formal question. The prison notebooks, please correct me if I'm wrong, were they edited by Galvano della Volpe or not?
The first time.
Yeah.
As I remember, Togliatti first published the selections. I don't know, maybe am I wrong, but
So it's not Galvano.
No.
First was okay.
okay. About yes, Gramsci used liberazione. Liberazione. In emancipation, I don't remember what is the word for emancipation in.
Emancipation.
I'm not sure if it's maybe it's in, but in prison notebooks, Gramsci used liberation because it is liberazione. It's coming from his understanding of hegemony, because the culture and ideology, even though the Marx couldn't.
Yes, by the way, I was right. It was emancipazione.
Emancipazione. Yes, in the prison notebooks, I don't remember if Gramsci used emancipazione, but liberazione he used. So in Gramsci, as I understand what Gramsci means, liberation, kind of emancipations. And culture is and ideology is related to his hegemony, his theory of hegemony, because according to Gramsci's theory, why the culture is kind of liberation, human liberation, is because the culture, the ideology is not only kind of criticizing Croce, who sees as kind of just instrument. For Gramsci, it's not just instrument, but it's liberate the people, and it's also the kind of to arrive the consciousness of the individual, his class consciousness, his cultural and social consciousness. In this sense, Gramsci said that the culture and ideology important before to take into power, before to establish the new hegemony. In this sense, the culture can be a kind of the liberation. It can liberate the individual, can liberate class from the dominant ideologies and dominant culture, and this can be happened through the organic intellectual of the subaltern class.
So can we call it as a phase of liberation, the phase of emancipation?
Phase of what you mean? Phase of
Part of or level of emancipation.
yes, yes, it is a part of the emancipation. It's not just the culture and ideology will emancipate directly you from the status quo, the dominant exploitative society, but it is a process that culture and ideology can lead this liberation.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I would also have two questions, and then maybe Yolita again, or maybe someone online, but we are already advanced in time too, which is great. So let me first ask, I have two questions. Suppose I'm what is called a working or practicing historian, and I have an interest in Gramscian theory. How would I go about my business? So you said Marxism is a theory of history. I do understand that. And I understand that sort of, on one level, Marxism is something like a social ontology. So there's base and superstructure, and then maybe there's a certain emphasis on practices as opposed to contemplation or whatever the opposite is. And maybe there's a certain emphasis on work, sort of that makes humans and that pushes history forward. Okay, that's fine. So I can have this theoretical background as a historian. Then another level is historical materialism, which sort of Gramsci doesn't want to fully engage in, right? Because historical materialism usually is two theses. All history is the history of class struggles. Then maybe in Gramsci, all history is the history of subaltern classes struggling, perhaps. And the second thesis is the stadial progression of history from primitive communism over slaveholder societies, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. As the goal of history. I would suppose that Gramsci, does he repudiate both of those theses, that all history is the history of class struggles, and that there's this stadial goal towards history? Because on one hand, he does want to emphasize practices, and sort of that people act, and they act in all kinds of ways. But on the other hand, he keeps to this goal of history, right? On one level, at least. How does he put them together? And the second question is about sort of the meta philosophy, and that came also out of discussion here. The identity of philosophy and history, or what was the term exactly? And sort of that philosophy becomes politics, like the last thesis of Feuerbach. No, philosophers only interpret the world, the point is to change it, and this sort of stuff. I find this a doubtful understanding of philosophy, if not outright wrong, in the sense of, maybe Gramsci doesn't agree to that, because on one hand, how would we establish the identity of philosophy and history, and what would that mean actually, sort of that? I mean, you can do it with Hegel or something and say that the actual history is the history of philosophy, kind of, and it's progressing like philosophy, and philosophy is the sort of goal of it in a sense. But if you don't do that, I don't see how you can say that there's identity in the history of philosophy. Quite on the opposite, I think there are quite a few philosophical questions that will remain even if we ever live in communism, you know? I mean, there are basic questions of epistemology and other stuff, they don't go away. Maybe you call it philosophia Bukharin or not, it doesn't matter, but those questions are not identical with history. We don't arrive in communism and suddenly we don't have the epistemological problems anymore. I would assume, right? So what does that mean for the identity of history and philosophy, if these problems remain, as I understand it? So those will be questions.
Okay, so these two questions I think related, no?
Maybe, let me know.
Yeah, I think they are very much related. You mean how if the history is the end of the history with the classless society, and it is mean for Marx and Gramsci the end of the history. This is the question that also I think Gramsci tried to answer in the in the prison notebooks, and I put quotations at the end of the book, and he said that if the philosophy of praxis, or philosophy of praxis and Marxism itself, the result of the contradiction, and because of the capitalist society, because of the bourgeois society, and through this contradiction, Marxism and philosophy of praxis exist. So the aim of Marxism and Marxism of philosophy of praxis is to have as ideology to have the class or the subaltern class to change the way of the history. So but according to Gramsci, this is with the classless society, the Marxism and also philosophy of praxis will finish because it is result of the contradictions. So, but it doesn't mean that it is end of the history, because history always creates the new contradiction and the new challenges, and the Marxism, maybe philosophy of praxis, will be end, but the contradiction continue to exist. The new problem will exist, and so we will need to new philosophy, and we will need the new philosophers, the new theories. Doesn't mean that the theory and the philosophy will end, but the new history, will end, the capitalist system, the class society will end, and the new, with the absolute, I think it means the new beginning. And this concept is later taken by other Marxists like Raya Dunevskaya and the Hegelian concepts, and also Lenin before also 1914 and 15 related with the Hegelian concept and leave more the vulgar understanding, the Stalinistic understanding of the history, and use the Hegelian concepts and the dialectic more the center of the history, and it doesn't just history introduce the materialist and economistic reductionist way, but more the dialectical and relationship between idealism and materialism. So in this sense, I think Gramsci already in prison notebooks, he said that when the classless society, not the end of the history will end, but the classless society will end, and then we will have new society, new human being, new civilization, new history, and new philosophy theorized the new.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
So maybe then it's all history is the history of contradictions, but maybe Yolita has the last question.
Yeah, so
a few questions.
I also had two questions, very short ones, because I feel like I'm still trying to get the bearings of this theory. Not all of it makes sense. So I will put it in a similar fashion. So let me assume I am a historian who is interested in the societies who lived in the past, and I want to do my history in the fashion, in this fashion that you introduced. What if the people acted upon their beliefs in some kind of metaphysical predispositions, like they had some kind of belief about the world that is metaphysical? As a historian, should I ignore it, or it comes down to saying that the society was not conscious enough, or what do I do? What is the role of eliminating metaphysics from this perspective? And then another question, is there anything beyond historicism? Is there any act pursuit that is not embedded within its history? Yeah, so two questions.
Eliminate metaphysical elements from history.
Yeah, you mentioned it in like the very first slides, not from the history, but there is this ideal of eliminating metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so does it work for history at all? Then maybe I did not get it right.
Yeah, in the sense that there is some metaphysical elements. For example, if you are saying that the motor of the history is matters, it is a materialist. It is a metaphysical understanding because it's not only matter. So it is also the other elements that also give the way to history. So you don't just reduce the history in the to matter or to economy. That the economy is determined of all the history, and the history is moved on the structural parts of the human beings, or society. But history is a relationship between these not just matter, but also the other human elements, human actions, human doing, human feelings, sentiments also determine make the history. In this sense, the materialistic metaphysical elements should not to see the history in materialistic view, to be deterministic, mechanistic, and not just spirit that determines the history, but also class situation or the economic structure also determine the historical conditions.
And if this society, the members of them, they were believing in some kind of metaphysical premises, it doesn't change what should I do as a historian, or like it doesn't matter then, I guess, at all what they actually believed. It's what they did.
Yeah, of course, if you just look this side of the issue, so it will be one-sided. No, just the people's beliefs on the God and determine the society and the human doing, human actions. But it is not just my belief that determine me, but there is other elements that lead me to act. My feeling, my family relation, my class relation, or my gender relation, or my other relation also determine the history. And many also our looking to history has changed many studies, subaltern studies, colonial studies, post-colonial studies, women feminist studies changed the history's perspective. For example, just patriarchal view of the history, or the just economical view of history, to reduce the history on just materialistic or metaphysical elements, that, for example, spirit, like Hegel did, or the other vulgar Marxists say that structure is determined the history. This is metaphysical perspective that Gramsci and Marx criticize. And for this reason, Gramsci attacked Croce to reduce the history just one point, and then to say don't see the class and the revolutions, also revolutionary activity movement, that how they determine it, how the class activity determine it, how the woman in the history eliminated for many years, and now the feminist studies brings it on the discussion. In this sense,
okay, it's much more clear now.
Okay, thank you. We are 10 minutes shy of 2 hours. So if there's one more very pressing question short, we could take it. Otherwise, we'll draw it to a close.
I had a second question.
You had a second question. Then I would.
It's very hypothetical, so I don't know.
You too.
No.
Then
It's an interesting question because I was thinking about the same kind of.
Then a very fast question. I would ask also for a short answer.
Okay.
Yeah, so anything beyond historicism, any human pursuit or anything physical, I don't know. Is there anything that is not embedded within its historical understanding, according to Croce?
No, I don't understand the question. Can you?
You said you
Well,
had
I don't know if you're
the
thinking
same lines.
along the same lines, but I was also been considering this, that if everything is historical, or historicist in this sense, everything is malleable, it's open to change, open to revision. So is there anything that escapes this kind of historicism in that sense? Let's say science. If we create a new society, class society, does science look different there too? Or is there anything that is basically neutral? Or escapes in this sense the historical condition?
If the science considered in the relation to history, in this sense, no. Because, for example, when in the Capital that I caught a footnote that David Harvey referring is also referred to technology that also as a science determine the history. It is a part of the history that with other elements that makes history.
They are all immanent. They are all immanent.
Immanent, okay. That's also Rick very
I
shortly.
don't know
Is
if
this,
I understand
is
well,
it the
because-
same issue, Rick? Rick, or you go again?
Yeah, well, Croce was quite clear on this. He said reality is history, and la realtà è storia. And he meant that at least human reality is history. Following Vico, of course, verum et factum convertuntur, we know what we have made, and that follows that everything humans have made, we can understand. And then, yes, science is historical in the sense that it develops in a historical way. Scientists reading each other's work, interpreting each other's work. If you do his science in the Croce would completely endorse Kuhn, for example, Thomas Kuhn, or for that matter, Popper and objective knowledge. So the evolution of knowledge is very much pointing to the historical aspect of doing science. The same for religion, the same for any human activity has an historical aspect which can be studied for itself. And that's what he meant by reality is history. And there's a good book by David Roberts on this, and Nothing But History, in which he compares Croce to Gadamer, Heidegger, etc. And he said, well, that's comparable. That's what he meant. But and I think Gramsci would endorse this view that human reality is history. But then his question is, how can we change it? How can we change history? How can we change the actual situation? And there you get a far more activist view of what historians should do in changing reality. So maybe that helps. But the motto of Croce's philosophy could easily be reality is history.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll give Sevgi the last word.
Yeah.
Then we'll close it, try to a close.
Yeah, no, I agree with Rick, but he said is Croce, even though Croce critics is going to positivism and the science, but it doesn't mean that it is a reality. It is in the it's related to human action who determine the reality and make reality. So he is there. So I just thank you.
Okay, well then
for
I'll
this
say thank you to
opportunity.
everyone. Thank you online, thank you offline for coming. We meet in 2 days again, same place, same time, online. If you meet us, talk on the methodology and philosophy of the history of philosophy. Okay. See you all.
Skip
Okay.
a bit late.
Oh, Keith arrived a bit late. Sorry, I
We're
didn't.
finishing.
There might have been a time hiccup, mix up. Okay, thank you guys.
Bye-bye.